Hello everybody and welcome to section 2. Here we're going to cover plate tectonics. So kind of wrapping this around to some of the first things we studied for the course. We're going to try to tie in plate tectonics and the material we covered last section about coasts and oceans. So let's go. So first we have a quick quiz. Can you name the type of boundary we're looking at here? Type of plate boundary for these three. I'll give you a moment. Okay, so divergent plates divide, convergent plates collide, and transform boundary plates slide. All right, remember this. Okay, so this diagram you guys have seen before. We won't spend too long. Here we have all the major plates in different colors, as well as some arrows just indicating the different ways that they move. A lot going on here. Talk about the margins specifically. Two types of crust at these. Well, two types of crust generally speaking, that we're going to talk about right away. Oceanic crust, thing that the ocean is on. Mostly this is comprised of basalt, that is dense and dark. And we have continental crust, granitic stuff. It's a little bit pinker, a little bit lighter color, and less dense. These two float up a little bit higher. So the continental margins are these places where we have a transition from the land, continental crust, to sea, oceanic crust. There's three parts of this that we're going to talk about. We have the shelf, the slope, and the rise. So let's have a diagram here. You guys have seen this before too, all right? Just saying. Here we have the continental shelf, so a little portion of continental crust that is submerged beneath an area of relatively shallow water. So the test question, the one all of you guys missed about where most sedimentary rocks are deposited, just here on the continental shelf. This is where most of the action happens as far as sedimentation. Right? We have broad, gentle shelf here, still part of the continental crust, yeah, but beneath the water. It is lower than the shoreline. Now, keep in mind, right? We have the shoreline right here, edge of the water. We have here where the continental crust and the oceanic crust meet. This is not necessarily a plate boundary. In fact, looking at this, this is definitely not a plate boundary in this particular diagram. All right, plate boundary is going to be somewhere out here. Just because we go from continental crust to oceanic crust does not mean that we have gone to a new plate. Something like the North American plate has continental crust and oceanic crust both. It's got both of them. So we have this continental slope here, and this is pretty exaggerated. It's not really this steep in reality, but makes for a better picture this way. Fairly steep compared to the shelf, outer edge between shelf and deep ocean floor. And then finally we have this little bit here, continental rise. If you're coming from here on the flat plane for the entire ocean bottom, you come here and get this gentle sort of rise before you got to the bigger slope, and then the shelf. And this is where continental crust actually meets the oceanic crust. So from more of a top-down view, this is all of our parts here. Here's our shoreline, there's our continent over here. We have this shelf, which is still part of the continent. We have our continental slope here, really broad. Our continental rise, a little bit more gentle, not as steep as the slope. And then we have the abyssal plain. Term, just means the bottom of the ocean. Flat bottom of the ocean, not as much life down there. And all this stuff in between, from shoreline to the flat ocean plain, is all continental margin. Now, there are two different kinds of margins we are going to talk about. We have passive margins, things like the Gulf Coast, where it's not earthquakes, there are no volcanoes on the Gulf Coast, something everybody should know. They look a little bit like this, not a whole lot going on as far as tectonic activity, and then you have active margins. These are closer to the plate boundaries. These tend to be pretty tectonically active places. So what is going on here? The tectonic activity is really what makes all the difference between these two. We'll cover this in a little bit more detail. So we have a map of our plates and plate boundaries for the entire world, breaking these into convergent, divergent, transform. And as you can see, Pacific plate is the first one. You should think about pretty much every edge of it that touches the continent is a convergent margin, even going all the way up here, including the little bitty Nazca plate here. Other convergent margins include this one going from Spain all the way over through Mediterranean and the Alps, all the way through Arabian Plate, all the way through India down here. Again, we'll cover this in more detail in a bit. So this is our different kinds of margins, just broadly speaking. Red ones are active, blue are passive. So where are the active margins? Around the edge of the Pacific Ocean, a little bit in South Asia, and the Mediterranean. Those are the big places to know. Closely associated, we have our ring of fire. So where are the volcanoes? Many of you missed this test question, trying to figure out what sort of boundary this was down here, this margin. Looking at this, which you have access to during the test, would be a big help for this. So volcanoes like this, when you have a lot of them, are usually going to be along an active plate boundary, something that is a convergent margin, or convergent boundary, excuse me. So active margin, you have the leading edge of continental crust near some kind of active plate boundary, either convergent or transform plate boundary. Typically get narrower, kind of thinner shelves on these than less wide and steeper slopes. You also get trenches in these locations. So the downgoing plate essentially drags the edge of the continent a little bit down with it in order to form trenches. These are the very deepest parts of the ocean, pretty much around the world. Commonly you get earthquakes, volcanoes, and uplift, all of your signs of tectonic activity here. And these are typically places where you have some sort of rugged topography, kind of rugged terrain to the region, lots of mountains. So we have our continental plate, we got our rugged stuff here, mountains and volcanoes, all the evidence of tectonic activity. Our narrow shelf, steeper slope, have our trench here, and then we have our ocean. Again, from the side, you have all these parts as well. What about the passive margin? So this is every sort of continent to ocean transition that is not near some sort of convergent or transform boundary, not an active place. You have this wide shelf or a gentle slope to these, no trenches, no tectonic activity, no mountains, no volcanoes, none of the big exciting stuff. Whenever you have a passive margin, it's more of a passive place. It's not doing as much. So processes that are dominant as far as shaping these are going to be weathering and erosional processes, not tectonics. You tend to get gentler land in these, less rugged. Have a broader shelf, gentler slope, quite a bit of a continental rise, and then you have the ocean bottom here. A lot less going on in terms of tectonics. You don't see any mountains, volcanoes on this, like you would see with the active margin. So active margin here, not going on. Passive margin, not so much going on. West Coast, active margin, lots of stuff, earthquakes, volcanoes, mountains, passive margin. East Coast, Gulf Coast, a lot less going on with these. This diagram kind of gives the overview of what we're talking about here. In the west, you see we have convergent, these are the blue, and transform in the green, all the way up and down the west coast. And on the east coast, there is no boundary at all. It's all the way out here. So this is a passive margin. It is not a plate boundary over here on the east coast and Gulf Coast. So picture form. California coast is active, rugged, west coast. Oregon coast, active, rugged, west coast, touching the Pacific. Florida coast, passive, gentler. Look at the broad beach here. Very, very gentle waves here on the Atlantic coast. South Carolina, a broad beach, much gentler, flat terrain here. Texas coast, broad beach, gentler, flat terrain here. Louisiana coast, very flat terrain here, broader, gentler. No mountains or volcanoes or earthquakes in this photo. You see something similar in South America. So here, where it's touching the Pacific, over here on the west coast, you have a convergent margin, subduction going on here, creating Andes here, and on the other side, have our passive eastern margin. And there are no volcanoes in Brazil, other than maybe hotspots. We're not going to talk about those. Next section, we're going to talk about ocean motion. What does the ocean do to these coastlines? How does it shape them? What are the forces involved? How do they work? See you then.